Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So today we're going to take on one of the persistent but complex questions of our time. Did humans come to this challenging place we find ourselves in by chance or by design? This is a huge topic with a lot of moving parts and theories, so we're going to bracket it here a little by sharing what we mean when we reference collectively being in a challenging place. By this we mean the rather substantive coming together of issues that pose serious, even existential threats to humanity's survival, such as the climate crisis, a creep toward potentially another world war, economic instability, the terraforming of most elements of life for better and for worse by technology and AI, and the erosion of democratic norms in favor of authoritarianism in the U.S. and elsewhere, just to name a few. The other area that needs a little definition is the overarching question we're conversing with each other about. Do we find ourselves in this place because we drifted here naturally, despite many opportunities to individually and collectively make healthier decisions? Or have our options individually and collectively been constrained and shaped in ways that have largely been invisible to us all?
Absolutely. So we want to begin with the signs of decline. And before we jump in there, I just want to say we sort of have three main components of today's discussion. The first is the signs of decline, because this is not just hearsay. This is really data points you can look at that demonstrate this. I think many people feel it intuitively, but we're actually going to talk about some data points specifically demonstrating this apparent decline in human health in various ways and human thriving in various ways. Then in the second segment, we want to talk about who and what is responsible for this decline, which will be an interesting question to entertain. And then finally, we want to talk about life-affirming actions we can all take to counter this, because we want to remind ourselves that we are powerful beings, that while we may have been in a situation where we've been quieted down and controlled to some degree, and again, we're going to get into how much of that was intentional or not, but we have immense power to step into our potential and to change the course of our civilization, beginning one by one. So that's kind of the course of today's topic. But we first want to talk about the signs of decline. So in addition to data points, there's also just the matter of us noticing this in our own lives. As we've been walking out our lives, we've seen what apparently looks like a lack of thriving, and that things that used to be taken for granted a few decades ago no longer are the case. So I want to begin with you, Janis, just some reflections from you as you've walked through your life, noticing some of that trend.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I think this was one of the earlier conversations you and I had and bonded around. As I told you, one of the most impactful and earliest trends I noticed was that I was born in the 60s. I grew up in the 70s. I mean, okay, I was in California, but where there was a focus on health. But I remember vividly as a teenager feeling like we're headed in the right direction, right? We just are learning so much more about how to keep our bodies healthy, about the food pyramid and the role of fruits and vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then I go on and I start working professionally directly with people, and I start noticing demographic trends like actual data. And at some point I guess it was in the early 2000s, I noticed what everybody else is noticing, which is everybody's getting unhealthier. We're all getting heavier and weightier, and we're walking less, and we're not eating the good stuff. And I remember so vividly when you'd get a cookie, and a cookie was like a cookie size, and you might have two. And then we got mega cookies and mega muffins, and everything got bigger. And I thought, what is going on? This makes no sense. And it seemed to be not occasional. It started to pervade everywhere. And if you ask people at the time, it was just like, well, we like more. It's kind of the American way. Bigger is better. And that makes sense, except that later I saw the CDC maps of obesity rates and the change in obesity rates when I think they started like 1984 or so, and they go up into the 2010s. But it's shocking. It's shocking. I would urge anybody to go look at those. You can look at the maps, and there's these trend maps of change over time. And we were adding rungs of the percentage of a state that was obese over sometimes just the course of years. And we were dropping rungs at the bottom part of the statistical ranges, right? So the range would be like below 5% or 6 to 10%. It was shocking, and I looked at that and I thought, this isn't natural. There's nothing about this that's natural. And then at the same time, as I was coming into my young adult years and I'm at college and I'm paying attention to stuff going on there, we start getting very concerning reports, which I then did validate, that the CIA was involved in running drugs into the inner cities of the USA. That was not just hearsay. There's data to support that. And I was like, what? Why? Why would you do that? And I think that's partly, some of my colleagues have suggested that that's in part responsible for the fact that projections are that 1 in 4 Black men will end up incarcerated. So there's a direct link between the kinds of activities that our government was undertaking and the health of our society in a lot of ways. And then, lastly for here, before I bounce it to you, because there's tons I can say on this, is just the mental health crisis. You know that I work in the area of mental health. I track that closely. I have for the last, probably my entire professional career, but certainly the last 25 years as an academic, where I was looking at data all the time. And it's impossible not to notice that we are not getting healthier. We haven't been. Even before COVID, people like to look at COVID as a big turning point, but frankly, it's been going on for decades. And you can see that in every single demographic we look at. And I'll suggest one in particular that everybody will know, and that's Columbine. When Columbine, that school shooting happened, and I do put that in the mental health category because a lot of school shooters are acting out mental health crises, as we know. So the Columbine happened in 1999, and at that point, there had not been anything like that. There were definitely shootings on campuses, but nothing on the order of that, where we have dozens of people dying. Since then, there have been so many mass shootings that I think we've lost track of it, at least 22. And it's gotten particularly bad since 2018 to 2023. We've had dozens. It's so bad now that, as you know, we hardly even hear about them in the news. So just those 3 big trends are concerning enough, but I could, if I were to go on, add even more to them, and we'll probably touch on some of those. But I want to bounce it to you just to see, what were you noticing as you were growing up or in retrospect?
Well, I'm definitely taken with the points you made because, as you said, I remember having this sense when I was in school. You were born in the 60s, I was born in the 70s, but I remember having this sense in school that the government did care about our health and that nutrition was something we were taught about and that this was brought to our awareness, like you said, the food pyramid and trying to balance your diet so that you got plenty of each of the nutrients you needed kind of thing. But then as you point out, when you actually look at the trends, I remember in one of our earlier conversations pointed this out to me, you had this kind of graphic where you showed the different states and how the obesity rates were going up in these different states, where there really was very little obesity in the 1970s, according to your graphic there. But then in the 80s, it started really ramping up. And as you pointed to, entirely new categories of obesity had to be drawn up, basically, because the percentages above normal were so high at this point. And that inevitably makes you ask the question, why? Is it just that, as you pointed to, it's the American way that bigger is better and we just have these huge portions? I think so. But one of the matters we want to get into today is how much of this comes down to, on the one hand, we do surrender some degree of our agency by letting our bodies dictate to us how we will live our lives. So in that sense, we do get these certain chemical hits in our brain when we eat things that taste good. Sweet things, high in sugar, the comfort food that we hear a lot about in American circles, those things make us feel good temporarily in our brain, even though they're detrimental to our health. The question is it just that we don't help ourselves, or is it that slowly there is something more nefarious going on? And again, even there, the question is that an implication of capitalism, or is that some sort of control structure? These are really fascinating questions, and maybe a bit of both. And depending on which program you might listen to, they might pursue one of those elements or the other. But I think we really want to get into each of them. We really want to be data-driven on this show. But I think one thing that's different about Event Horizon from some other shows is that we don't just look at data. We also are aware of these other forces that are often not accounted for, either human groups that are kind of running things behind the scenes to some degree, and we'll get into some of that, and potentially even some tie-ins with some non-human intelligence as well. That's controversial, but I think we at least have to consider that. So let me toss it over back to you for some thoughts on that particular aspect.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that, part of what I like about being able to have this conversation and to have it with others is that we are data, and I do feel like a lot of the things that confused us as we were growing up, the things that confuse me now are worth looking at. I do think as a psychologist, to speak to one of the things you just raised, one of the trends I've noticed over and over and over, both personally and professionally from the entire arc of my life, is that, we know a lot about human vulnerability and human capacity to thrive. We know about what makes us tick. There was a massive amount of research going on in the 70s in particular around what are the conditions under which humans thrive? What are the conditions under which human vulnerability can be exploited? And I think the assumption that most of us had was, okay, we're going to use that research to help us thrive. That is not what happened. To the best of my ability to construe it, having watched, and it's going to be hard for me to empirically walk that path here, right? Because it's really literally decades of watching. But the take home for me is like, no, that data has been used to exploit our vulnerabilities. And some of that is clearly just what capitalism does, right? How do you sell people more? How do you sell them more dopamine drips? You get in, they don't even know. They think it's their choice. They're going to buy the big mega muffin or whatever. But we know using, there's been lots of studies of nudge theory now that suggests that how you place things, what they look like, what you frame it with, where it shows up in the, when you walk through a store, all of that matters. And you can definitely move people in a particular direction. The thing that became very obvious is that what was being understood about human vulnerability was actively, aggressively being exploited in ways that transcended purely, small business or even larger business incentives. The patterns that you might expect to see from just business. I mean, it felt bigger than that. The thing that was the most disturbing as we hit the 2000s for me is like, wow, I'm seeing all these things come together. So you've got a less healthier by a lot physical society. And what happens when your body isn't healthy is your mind can't function well. You're easier to program. It's easier to send you lots of messages about what you want, even though you don't know that you're being sent messages. And we can get into that in a little bit, because I did do some deep diving at one point into what's the science? What have we learned about how to use media, for example? And crazily, and not surprisingly to all of us, we've learned a lot, and it's used very aggressively to market largely negative messages. What was happening behind there, I wondered. So we found, I think most of us know, wealth disparities were growing radically. There has been this massive siphoning off of resources while we've all been busy eating our Cheetos and watching TV. The wealthy are getting much wealthier and the poor are getting much poorer, and the gaps are much bigger. And, it was like we're not supposed to be paying attention to the fact that the 2022 World Inequality Report found that the share of wealth held by the richest 10% globally rose from 61%, which was already a lot in 1980, to 76% by 2021. There's been these things going on in the background, basically, that we have not been paying attention to because we've been so busy consuming stuff that has degraded our capacity to really stay not just centered, but connected to each other. So yeah, I'll pass it to you, Fran. I know you have thoughts.
Yeah, so one thing that occurs to me is I think some people might want to push back and say, wait a second, aren't individuals actually choosing to eat that mega muffin? And what I would counter there, I think, is by saying that, yes, to some degree, there is individual responsibility here and accountability, absolutely, for our own health. But I think what happens, again, we can get into how much of it was intentional, but what has happened over time is people feel like they have less flexibility, less malleability in their lives. They feel less powerful. And because of that, they now turn to things that give them quick fixes, because overarchingly they have this kind of fog around them where they feel like this system doesn't really serve them. So they settle for some of these smaller pleasures. So it kind of comes down to, again, what I remember when I was in school, and what you talked about as well, is it's one thing if you sense as a kid and later as an adult that the entire system is working for the thriving of all human beings. If you see that's the case, then you actually want to do your part to be a healthy individual and part of a healthy society. But if instead you actually feel like what is really pushed is consumerism as the end goal, full stop, then you just inevitably end up assuming that means I'm just supposed to consume. And again, when you don't feel like you have control, and one of the things we'll get into is how there are other elements that you partly just pointed to with the wealth gap. Even things like housing inequality, right? How much more difficult it is for young generations to buy a house today. And even though, employment is high, inflation's been off the charts, as many people know. So taking this beyond just economic data, again, we want to get down to what is underlyingly going on here. And when people feel like they don't have much flexibility over the largest aspects of their lives, then inevitably they end up just making decisions about these smaller things that sometimes go to dopamine drips in their mind and that kind of thing. So this is going to be a nuanced conversation, right? I think this is one thing we want to do is not assume there's some deeply dark, nefarious group that's trying to run people into the ground. It may be partly, again, just the implications of capitalism. It may be that there are some groups that want people to have a certain amount of freedom, but be guaranteed that they never step outside of a certain expected range so that their wealth and their control over resources can continue. So this is, again, a nuanced conversation, but I want to point to a couple elements and then get your thoughts on some of these things in terms of specific data points so people know that we're not just assuming this is the case. For instance, one thing that's really interesting is the decline in sperm counts. Right? This is very, very interesting. Now, of course, this prompts additional questions like, why is that happening? Is there something going on with environmental factors? Is it about the quality of the air? Is it about the diet that we're consuming? Like you talked about, so much heavily processed kind of foods now with all sorts of chemicals. We know that microplastics are being found in all sorts of the human body, including testicles of men and brains. Absolutely, we're finding microplastics as well. We would be naive to not think this could have implications for reproductive health and all sorts of other measures of health. So that's one right away that says to me, we have not done the research we thought we would do. What I point to here is that I think my assumption when I was young was that there's plenty of research being done to make sure these things could not harm me before they're being given to me. Now we realize, thinking back to in the 70s and 80s, I noticed it in the 80s, when suddenly plastics were everywhere because they're easy to use, they're comfortable for corporations to produce. But of course, the problem is that plastics don't degrade. So they end up being in the environment for a very, very long period of time. And these microplastics, like we say, end up in our water supply and whatnot, and now are inside the human body. So again, interesting questions here around, is this a matter where, when we maximize and optimize for capitalism, we end up with situations that degrade human health because we don't put enough emphasis on preparation, research, those kinds of things before introducing these things? But again, you could also argue that the decline in sperm counts is something else, perhaps more nefarious in terms of population control and those kinds of things. So let me pass it to you in terms of how you make sense of those particular matters.
I think we always end up in some kind of tricky territory. As I said earlier, it's kind of tough to paint this empirically, especially in the venue we have here. So I'll just ask you to trust at least a little bit in the fact that I do have access to the research. I have read a lot of that research. Human thriving and resilience and mental health is what I've studied from the front end in the field, working with people directly, and then as a researcher. That research exists. We know very well what it takes to support and create healthy humans. It's not a mystery. It's just that what it looks like to me, frankly, is that research has been used to do exactly the opposite. Because when we know how to support healthy functioning, healthy brain function, how do you promote the capacity for critical thinking? It's not just an idea. You need healthy bodies. You need to not have them polluted with all sorts of contaminants. I mean, most women in the country know, but there are massive numbers of chemicals in makeup for women that aren't allowed in Europe. We have over 100 chemicals allowed in makeup here. I don't know if people saw, but just recently there's been reports about toxic chemicals in tampons, lead and arsenic and things that, like, why? What is going on with that? It looks to me in some ways, and I don't mean to be vastly conspiratorial, but I gotta say my spidey senses have started going off about a decade ago. I'm like, something is up. It looks like we're taking that research and using it to make us sicker. And now we're seeing, and we have been seeing for a good number of years, at least a decade, really clear indicators, as you pointed out. Sperm counts is a big one. I'll be honest in saying that when online porn came in, I was like, this is not good. This is not good, because part of what you're going to do, just exploiting the vulnerability of humans, particularly the human male, with massive amounts of dopamine. And it's obvious to me, this was 2005, where this is going to go. You're going to lead to less intimacy with real people, because it's cheap and easy and, totally get that. But you're also going to lead to more violence against women because that's what's being modeled. Part of what has to happen in order for somebody to get, more dopamine is it gets more extreme. That's the way we know that. We understand that about chemicals. You need more intensity over time. So it doesn't surprise me, for example, that we have this really horrific case right now in France. I don't know if anybody's following that, but there's just things happening out in the world that are completely predictable if we assume that there has been, if not nefarious intent, then just a boatload of excusing of organizations, corporations intending to make a lot of money off of human degradation. And why is that?
Yeah, great points. And again, I think we want to walk this line here. We're not assuming this is some sort of nefarious campaign behind all of this, but part of it is the implication of when you have a capitalistic system that is only structured in such a way as to gain shareholder value, then that inevitably says human health takes a second seat to that. And there are vast implications for that. And one of the things we're getting to here is that with the amount of data that these big corporations have access to, they can make this process so efficient, right? They can learn from algorithms and whatnot. I want to get into in a second social media and what that's meant. With these algorithms, they can learn exactly how to tap into those dopamine feeds for people. So like you said, with pornography, that's about taking something that is part of the human drive that was meant to be found not very often in order to make sure the species procreated, right, and continued. Now you have it happening where it's available all of the time, and that dopamine feed can be constant, and it's addictive. Same thing with sugary foods, right? Evolutionarily, our ancestors didn't find sugar that often. They would have this major dopamine pump when they did find sugar. Now, sugar is everywhere, even in things you don't think would have sugar. Breads and whatnot have all sorts of sugars in there. So we have this really high sugar diet, which we know from the data is not good for us. These things that we know, to your point earlier, are not healthy, are nevertheless being introduced. And the excuse that's being made that you kind of pointed to is that, well, people are choosing to buy these things. Yes, they are. But number one, are they being educated enough about these things? And number two, do they feel like they have the amount of malleability in their life that they can begin to consciously make better decisions? Of course, on one hand, yes, it comes down to human responsibility. Absolutely. We're not trying to dismiss that. But we're talking about the environment that's being created. Now, let me get into social media, because one of the most fascinating aspects that you and I have talked about in being Gen Xers is that we were the pre-internet generation. We were the last pre-internet generation. So we remember what life was like prior to the internet, and certainly prior to something like social media. So, for instance, when I was young, I remember going riding with my BMX, and my other friends had their BMX bikes, and we would go to these tracks and race around these tracks. And now I know a lot of parents have a really hard time getting their kids off their devices, off their phones, off their tablets. I went through some of that with my kids. But what's interesting is when the internet first came online, I remember the sense was this was going to maximize human freedom because we were going to have all these different sources around the world. Anybody with a device could create a website and start sharing information. So it seemed like it was going to make the Library of Alexandria look like this tiny thing in comparison to what the internet was going to become, which was this amazing resource for information. The thing is, that's not actually what has happened. And what the internet looks like today is so different than that initial promise. So I remember in those early years of the internet, you could find some average guy in his basement was writing some information and people could access it everywhere. Of course, then the search engines came along, which made decisions about what information would be put in front of people when they had certain queries they punched in. And of course, once you have that capacity, then those large corporations can control what results you get from those kinds of queries. And suddenly you saw the numbers of websites actually being accessed going down considerably, right? So where we should see this explosion, and early on we did see an explosion of many, many more sites every year, exponentially growing. But now what we're finding is that fewer and fewer sites are being accessed and accessed constantly. So for instance, social media. Now, of course, when a few corporations control these search engine algorithms, they can set things up in such a way that it preferences their websites and the websites of their partners and that kind of thing. So social media came online, which was a sort of second-level internet revolution, where suddenly it's like people could talk in real time back and forth to each other. But even there, rather than having this burgeoning of human freedom and being able to talk to people on the other side of the world and hopefully have us having our perspectives expanded because we're interacting with people that are not like us, what has actually happened is the opposite. We have this kind of tribal move where we have these echo chambers where people who might have a very narrow view can find people somewhere in the world that have the same view as them. And then you get this kind of repeat of the same information over and over again. You have the same people with the same perspective only talking to each other, creates this echo chamber and gives them this false sense of how right they are and assumes everybody else is wrong. Now, with, for instance, Facebook, Twitter, those kinds of social media platforms, specifically Facebook has been found guilty of this. What they found with their algorithm was that if you can market hate, fear, and greed, you will maximize people's engagement with the platform. So again, this is the challenge when you have capitalism as your only real goal. Because if your job as a person trying to come up with these algorithms and fine-tune them is to make sure people stay on the platform, because if they stay on the platform, they see more marketing, you make more money, your shareholders are happy, on it goes. The problem is they found that fear, hate, and greed were the things that would most keep people engaged. I remember, you probably remember as well, this one woman who used to work at Facebook actually left the company and testified before Congress about this, saying, listen, this is not good for human civilization. This is actually increasing the echo chambers. It's making our society more violent. It's making these hate groups more convinced that they're right, and they're feeling affirmed because they're only talking to each other. This is not good for the future of human thriving. So this is one of the challenges. Again, even if you just take away the sense that there's some nefarious underbelly to all of this, you just think about capitalism and you think about these few companies who have massive wealth and massive control of the internet, you inevitably go here. So these are some questions we have to address, and we're going to get into later, how we can counter this. But what are some of your thoughts when you think about those moves that have happened in our lifetime?
Well, so the person you're thinking of is Frances Haugen. I vividly remember that because one of my areas of expertise is social media and mental health, and I get queried by press and so forth around this. And I remember her testimony, and it was just another drop in this idea that has started to form in a lot of the circles I live in, even though it's tough to point to exactly, is that, the soup, that's like if a fish swims in sick water, it's going to get sick. And so much of what we're seeing now, it seems like, is the pollution directly going into the water. And we're getting sick. And we're seeing, part of the messaging I always do when I go to do talks around youth mental health these days is we have to stop thinking about individual pathology or even family pathology as a unique vector for mental health. It feels much more like what would be normal, healthy, developing kids and people are becoming sick because the environment is sick. And so the bigger question is why? How has it happened? Because if it were just a few isolated corporations here or there, or if it was, whatever, or if it was just even capitalism, what is it? People want to be healthy. I think it doesn't make sense to poison. It doesn't make sense to poison your consumers. And if you look at from the vantage point I'm at, I look at all these different vectors and I see it everywhere. And mostly, actually, as a psychologist, I'm like, I know that if you make humans fearful enough, physically sick enough, mentally compromised enough, emotionally scared enough, then they would become very compliant. And it becomes very easy to program them. They don't know that that's happening, but there are a lot of clearly well-articulated, very well empirically validated ways to tell a human what they should be thinking and doing. So I have to partly look at the preponderance of fear coupled with and there's a lot of different ways to make us afraid, right? Some of it is just the content you encounter in social media, as you said, but some of it is making us afraid that we're not going to be able to feed our families. mean, there's a massive amount of fear at the moment in my world. I don't know about yours, but I know a lot of people who are really struggling just to make ends meet. Well, when people are struggling like that, they're much less likely to question anything. They're just busy trying to make ends meet. So I do tend to look at things like the massively growing wealth gap that has happened globally as part of this phenomenon. And I'm like, where does this come from, I wonder? Why is it? It does seem, if not coordinated, it's co-occurring. There's a lot of co-occurring vectors for fear, for lack, for rage, just, and then it gets stoked up in all these different ways. It's hard for me to come to the conclusion, having lived on this planet nearly 60 years, that this isn't by design to some degree. The question becomes why and who and where. And this is where, you and we try to be very careful. I don't want to venture into all the possible terrible scenarios because they're pretty dark and we don't know for sure. The one thing I do feel pretty confident about as a human and a professional is that there does seem to be a design at play. And I don't exactly know, it doesn't seem to be. I wouldn't answer the question we first posed as like, yeah, I don't think we just kind of arrived here because human nature brought us here. I think there's been some clear pumping up of the factors that keep humans small, but why? And I don't know that we can answer that question.
Yeah, great points. And one thing that occurs to me also as a data point that's really relevant here is the decline in attention spans. So again, this is a multifaceted topic because on the one hand, you can say, well, this is just an implication of when you have social media and you have these kind of soundbite kind of culture where people are seeing images and sounds broadcasted in really short order, one after the other, which we know on the one hand, again, from the research, keeps people engaged, right? If you keep flashing images at them, they will not be able to look away because this is not natural. So from an evolutionary point of view, when we were seeing things happening that way really quickly, images coming into our awareness quickly, we were told to lock on. We were kind of evolutionarily shaped to lock on. So again, companies found that if they do this, people don't look away. They sort of become zombie-like and get into a trance-like state and stay engaged. The challenge, though, in the long term, beyond the fact that that's manipulative, is that it weakens people's ability to stay engaged with one thing when the change isn't happening rapidly. So I've talked to several people, I'm sure you saw this in mental health as a psychologist. I've talked to even university professors who have said to me they've noticed a massive degrading of attention spans amongst the populations of students coming into the school. Whereas now the idea of saying that you've got to read this 20-page essay before Wednesday and give me your reflections on it used to be commonplace. Now that becomes really difficult. Some of those students have never done that. They've never sat down and read something that's that long and engaged with it and stayed engaged. Now, of course, the reason why that's really tricky as well is because if we are to try to sort out what's going on in the world, what is the truth behind all of these different data points, you have to be able to stay engaged. You have to realize it's a marathon to do the research, to try to uncover things. So the trick is, on the one hand, by seeing attention spans diminish over time, it makes it much less likely that even an empowered populace would ever be able to figure out what actually is going on. And that can be used, again, to empower potentially this control group. Now, before we get into this matter of who and what is responsible, I just want to, again, underline that this is a tricky thing because I know you and I have talked about people we know who came into lots of money. And rather than getting to a certain point where they go, great, I've made my goals, this is where I wanted to get to, now I'm going to completely change my life and start giving back. Instead, what often happens is the goalposts keep moving. I have 2 million, now I need 4 million. I still don't feel satiated, so maybe I need 10 million. And it becomes this thing that's an end in itself. So partly what we're getting at here is not that these control groups are made up of wealthy people who are just deviously behind the scenes thinking about this in a way to control others. It's that they have become slaves to some degree to this wealth kind of chase as well, because they are out of touch with who they truly are. They're out of touch with what actually makes us feel fulfilled as human beings, which primarily I would point out is connection, right? Connection with each other, connection with the planet, connection with a larger cosmic community, the sense of cosmic oneness, those kinds of things. So they've also become victims of the situation The challenge is it's like a runaway train now, where you have some intentional controlling of human populace, and you have some people in those control structures who are actually very disempowered themselves and are slaves to their own wealth chase. So this sort of gets at why this is complex. But let's now shift into this part of the conversation, which is who and what is responsible for the things as they are now. I'm going to turn it over to you. You finished a minute ago by saying you came to the conclusion that this is not just happenstantial. There's something to a design here. So maybe you can give some more thoughts on how you've wrestled with that and why you've ended up there.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And I so appreciate the comments you made about, I think part of the design is to make it hard to make a coherent argument about it without sounding like you're, conspiracy theorist. But I will just note, I think we said this at some point, that conspiracy theory as a term was popularized by the CIA, trying to keep people away from the Kennedy narrative, alternative Kennedy narratives, right? So that's also, I think, part of the design. We both have dug into the UAP cover-up. So this is what I guess I'd want people to know. The idea that forces that would wish to push us in very particular directions in terms of narrative or emotions or whatever are learning about emotions and narratives at the same rate we are as a public is ridiculous. I mean, they, like corporations wanting to sell us a product, they are absolute masters at human persuasion. Like, they know human psychology. Some of the best psychologists on the planet have worked for probably some of the forces that would push us in one direction or another, right? So deep understanding of how to drive cognitive overload and distraction, deep understanding of subliminal messaging, deep understanding of how to use frequency to evoke certain kinds of emotional states and even some kinds of thought states, deep understanding of how to use emotional manipulation. We see that all the time. They didn't just discover it. It's been studied. It's been experimented on. I mean, there is a tight body of research that shows exactly what to do. And I would argue, I think I see signs of it. I see the fingerprints of that in a lot of this. And so the question then becomes, well, what's the goal here? What's the end goal here? I mean, it doesn't serve anybody, as we were saying earlier, for the soil we live in or the water we swim in, and for that metaphor, to be really sick. Or does it? Like, I don't know. And the answer is I don't know, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds because I don't personally find it useful. I don't personally find that incredibly useful, but I do think it's worth us asking those questions. Like, that's part of the reason I think we decided to do this, is like, we should all be questioning. Take a look in your own life. Take a look at what you've noticed. Ask yourself, is it, does it feel natural? And if not, so what is the agenda? Well, all right. So if we start thinking about the agenda, and I'm going to be kind of careful and conservative here, then I'm going to say at the most spacious, generous end, it's just corporations and capitalism doing what it does. As I said, I don't see signs of that. I think it's more than that. The imprints of something more is all over the place, and we can point to lots of different cover-ups and programs that we both know about and that a lot of our listeners know about that would suggest that a slightly more nefarious intent of some sort or another. There does seem to be an effort to make us distracted, uninterested in the things we should be interested in, malleable, programmable, and programmable in our particular direction, and that direction doesn't serve us. I can't see how it's benefiting anybody, even some of the corporations who want to be able to continue to sell us stuff. So what's going on underneath there is a little bit fuzzier, and I think I'll just pause and let you respond to that piece, and maybe if we want to dig in more there, we can, because it's interesting.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned conspiracy theories, and yes, I know that Richard Dolan points this out regularly, that this is a term that was coined by the CIA and basically presented in such a way as to make people think you don't want to be one of those conspiracy theorists, do you? Those people are a little bit crazy and wear the tinfoil hats. They do that in a way to deflect people from looking in certain areas they don't want them to look in. Now, if we go back to, for instance, Dwight Eisenhower, when he gave that speech to the American people saying there's real concerns about the extent of control wielded by the military-industrial complex. So let's be clear about this. This is not just some people in some back room throwing out some conspiracy theories based on some ill-supported kind of notions. This is a president of the United States who had to engage with these different agencies and whatnot, and he himself becoming overwhelmed with the power they wielded And of course, this raises questions about how much do we really live in a democracy? Who really is in charge? So I first want to point people to that, especially the people who are skeptical of this. Why is a president of the United States warning the American people, if we don't do something, this is going to completely run amok, basically? The other piece I want to get into is that it's very clear when you do look at the historical record around matters like JFK, for instance, but even matters like UAP, as you pointed to, it's very clear that part of the way this has been controlled, and this is not a question, this is very clearly demonstrated in the data, is through disinformation. So we know there are groups who have deliberately fed disinformation into the system so as to confuse, confound, and exhaust people. So when you pair that with what we talked about earlier, with declining attention spans, then you have kind of an ideal situation for these control groups because they can seed disinformation in. And even if there is some real information that is there, people eventually become exhausted because you're deliberately countering that. And sometimes in the same bit of information drop, you're putting some real information out there with some disinformation, which undermines the entire credibility of the entire matter and makes some people just give up or assume the whole thing must be hogwash. So this is something to be aware of, right? Is that we know, this is not conjecture, we know that these different aspects of our own government have deliberately deceived the American public. And again, the challenge here is just like I talked about the people who become millionaires, billionaires, who have massive amounts of wealth, disproportionate, that's so insane. You also have these various agencies of our government who maybe began with the right intentions, and because of fear states we get into, for instance, during the Cold War, we heavily fund these programs and these agencies to the point where they become almost governments unto their own. And because of secrecy and the sense that we have to silo away this information, we end up with these situations where there's not even any accountability about how much money is being funded there and what it's being used for. And at some point, they start thinking about the fact that their livelihood is dependent on this constant flood of funds. And so then you can increase fear states to keep that sort of flood of funds going. Again, this is something we know is happening, right? And we have former presidents talking about this. We clearly know from people like David Grush, when he came out, he pointed out not just the fact that it is true that there are bodies being held of recovered non-human intelligence, as well as craft, sometimes parts of craft, sometimes fully intact craft that have been attempted to be reverse engineered by military contractors, again, part of that military-industrial complex. But he also pointed out that there has been an ongoing, decades-long campaign to deceive the American people. So it's not just about what they're not telling us, it's what they're telling us instead. So it's not just that they have been tight-lipped about acknowledging whether or not the UAP phenomenon is real. They've actually been very intentional and proactive about seeding misinformation, disinformation into the situation, constantly discrediting and sometimes even murdering people who know too much, people who've even come out of these programs, so as to keep this secret. So if people, again, are skeptical of this notion that there are control groups, there definitely are. We see a lot of evidence of this. And I think one of the most impacting aspects for me of my journey over the last few years, as I've explored UFOs and NHI, is that what I've learned about human nature and what I've learned about my own government in terms of just how much of 20th century history that we were taught is likely not accurate, right? So one of the really interesting things is I've been involved in some people who've been painstakingly recovering information that's in paper form often from 20th century history, and then with the advent of AI, being able to connect certain dots and reconstruct 20th century history as it actually occurred, as opposed to what we've been taught by these control structures, and it's considerably different. So I'd love to turn it over to you for some of your thoughts there, because if people wonder if this is really going on, there's plenty of evidence to suggest it is going on. The question just really is, how widespread is it?
Yeah, I think you bring up some really important points. And mostly what I've encountered in people, including in myself first, right? But it's been a while now, is the incredulity, like the inability to like, no, that they wouldn't do that. Nobody would do that. Nobody has, I mean, I don't have that in me. I want to help people thrive. I can't, the inability to wrap your brain around what is possible that humans can do to each other. I think it's become easier to wrap your brain around in the last few years because we've just seen so many. There's just been many moments in the past decade in particular where I'm just like, wow, I just had no idea. And I've had to have an idea. Right now I'm like, wow, we're really in it. But the capacity for human evil, the capacity for human massive immorality, the capacity for humans to degrade and hurt and demean and control in order to get what they want, whether it's other people or the planet, resources, is just mind-numbing. And I think that's the biggest hurdle. And my heart always hurts for people when they start. They're like, really? Like, yeah, it's like really bad, isn't it? I think we're all coming out of that haze, that sense that, of course, our fellow people, especially our government, especially our military, especially, I don't know, the people the ones that are most powerful among us. No, they don't want to hurt us. They may want to get stuff from us, but they don't want to hurt us. I think coming out of that illusion is one of the hardest parts of the passage that we're in right now, but it is happening slowly. And like you, I had to go dig into the empirical data to just be sure. I would never want to say something to anybody in my world along those lines. I didn't want to be a conspiracy theorist, quote unquote. I didn't want to be that. That term has been used to keep us away from where we really need to be going, and not to generate more fear in ourselves and not to generate more rage. I think that actually is a wrong thing. And that's part of, this larger conversation of, all right, how do we meet this moment? And it opens up a whole other set of elements around consciousness and the ability to stay centered and how not to feed the beast. The beast feeds on fear, greed, rage, all the stuff that it also tends to come up when we discover how ugly some parts of this are. But I'll say, maybe this is a good segue for us to another component of this. I think one of the things that I've also been amazed by is how beautiful we are. I know a lot of us who really want to thrive. We really do want to help others. I can see tons of evidence that there has been, if for the fact that there have been really powerful programs in place to kind of keep us stunted as a species or as a people, I think we could be in a really radically different place if for those things. And we can be, right? I think there's a lot of elements among our collective that are exactly diametrically opposite of that desire to thwart, control, hurt, demean, whatever, that wants to open, expand, thrive. Why can't we bring the same amount of power and potency to the question of how do we create societies that really enhance health, well-being, thriving life to the question of how do we control, demean, whatever, get more from, extract resources from. We can bring the same mind that can do that can create what Eisenhower warned us about, and which has only grown over the past several decades, can turn their minds to the other questions and create something amazing. And I would argue that now that we really are becoming a spacefaring species, now that we are on the brink of massive technological shifts beyond, our capacity to collectively and individually understand, that is the right question to ask. I think so many of us assume that human nefariousness or human desire to extract and use is normal. It's the natural way of humans. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think we've been kind of taught to think that for whatever reason. But if you let humans just do what we might naturally do, I think we'd see as much beauty and expansion and goodness as we do anything else. And that's the thing that's been kind of choked off. But if I could leave our listeners with anything, it's like, ask yourself, what do you assume about human nature? And where did you get that idea? And what actually is really possible? And how can we collectively come together, both physically as well as sort of energetically, and say, we don't want that anymore. We want to create something that really enhances life wherever we find it, whether it's human life or life on the planet, because we need it to live and to thrive. And let's see what we can create when we do that.
Right. And something else I would say too, in terms of human thriving, is that what's interesting is, and you and I have both talked about this, is that in addition to this kind of winnowing down and, like you say, stunting of human potential, we also see a great awakening that's happened over the last few years. And this is really encouraging, right? And I think there's a few points I want to get into here in terms of the nuances of this. Because on the one hand, I want to remind everyone that I think both Janis and I have this perspective that we are part of a larger cosmic community, a larger move of consciousness beyond what we see happening in our everyday waking world. So while I do think there are elements in certain kinds of entities of a non-human kind who are not necessarily even embodied, they do sort of prey on human fear states, right? Can actually exacerbate and dial that up. And that's why it's important to be really aware of your own energy, right? Again, these are things that we've been sort of distracted from being aware of. And one of the things I try to do in my classes and whatnot is help people get back in tune with what's really happening for them energetically so they can be empowered, right? And also be aware of when that's being manipulated either by some human group or endeavor or by something perhaps that is not exactly evident in our waking state awareness. But what's really fascinating is that when I think about the number of people who've become awakened over the last few years because of the UAP phenomenon, we talked a bit about this, I think, in one of our last podcasts. It's fascinating, and I don't think it's just happenstantial, right? So when we talk about design or not, what's important to point out here, it's not just about the nefarious design, because again, there is some lower vibe, low consciousness elements, both in humanity as well as outside of humanity, that will try to exploit situations from a point of separation. But equally so, there are groups, both human and non-human, who recognize we're all connected, who recognize we're all one ultimately, who are trying to seed this awakening. And on top of that, as things get darker and more challenging on the one hand, it also creates the contrast, which serves as the seeds for the awakening and the opening. And I think that's all connected. And I think this partly has to do with how ecosystems in these nested kind of fractals always work towards restoring order and harmony. And there's an emergent aspect of consciousness where greater complexity comes online. So this is something we definitely want to end on today, right, is recognizing that this is happening. This is also in the data, right? This is not just also hearsay. It's very clear many, many people have woken up. We're talking about 180-degree turns, right? I have met numerous people now, just within the last couple months, who would have called themselves physicalists, that is, reductionist materialists, and atheists a few years ago, but now actually see everything as purposeful, as meaningfully driven, as sensing that even this lifetime is about learning to work with energy primarily, so it's less about material goods and those kinds of concerns. So again, it's driving them deeper into themselves to understand who they truly are, why they're actually here. It's moving them away from the distractions, getting them in touch again with their core purpose, and then they go and they seek out others that also recognize that. And that's also happening in our world, and that part is really exciting.
Yeah, oh, I love that. I mean, that is really true. I mean, it's easy to get infatuated with this layer of the design, the human layer, what the human actors have been doing. And, you know, I know both of us know people who kind of come into this living room, I think of as consciousness through, oh my God, I can't believe the government would do blah, 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 or blah, 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 whether it's right or wrong. They just grappling with that. But frankly, the most fascinating part of the design, if we're going to do that, is the bigger design beyond that. And you just spoke to that so eloquently in the sense that, as I understand it and experience it, polarity is the engine of evolution. I mean, you know, if if everything's fine and dandy, we don't really do a whole lot. We just kind of keep going. It's in part, and I think in some ways, the more human elements or whatever elements they are that have been dumping the crap into our environment, literally and figuratively, have had to do more and more over time because we are ready as a species to begin what we're seeing, this process of awakening, you call it. It's, for me, it's the process of remembering. We're remembering the deeper truths of our nature. We're remembering the deeper truths of reality, that there was a before, there is an after. It's time for humanity to start really remembering and connecting with that in order to take the next evolutionary leap. And for a while, like you, I was like, God, it's just this. I mean, I was in yoga for a long, long time, and I could see it there. Lots of people doing it for their own purposes. But at some point, I don't know, a decade or so ago also, it was like, I feel like this is going to be, it's just time, and you're going to see more and more people who would never in a million years have expected they'd be interested in consciousness or listening to something like this or working with either one of us in this area, but they'd find themselves deeply driven. And that is, there's just been massive amounts of data over the last several years to suggest, no, it's a real thing. And there are more and more and more people being called to consciousness, to awareness, to yoga, to the mysticism, to the UAP piece, which I think is very much about consciousness. It's time. It's ready. We're ready. And some of what has gotten us there is the deep darkness, because it has just been a wake-up call. What do you really want? Where do you really want your energy to go? Do you really want to sit in front of this device and be programmed? Or do you want to get up and go outside and start that process of remembrance? And more people are choosing the latter. So in some ways, I don't see this storyline as the story of nefariousness, really. I see it as the story is the human moment for evolution. It's the human moment for opportunity. It's the human moment of remembrance. Every one of us is getting the choice about what to do, but it does feel like it's here, it's now, the choice is now, and there's more and more resources like both of us to assist people and lots of others. So I'm excited largely. I don't feel terrified. More, I'm like, ooh, this is interesting.
I absolutely agree. And I think both you and I have this sense that there are these, again, nested fractals that are trying to drive towards harmony and increased connection. And one thing I always like to point out on the podcast and in my classes and whatnot is that this interconnected field is the nature of things, right? It's when we are obscured from that fact that we get off track, that actually, if we can remove the obstacles, we will see what's always been there. We are these eternal beings. We don't die. That fact is the case. It's these illusions of separation and whatnot that make us believe that that's not the case and make us pursue these other kinds of matters and material goods and material ends and collecting things that is actually driven by a deep sense that something is off. The sense that is off is that we actually are not separate, that we actually are one. So it is exciting, and I agree that even if we look at some of the nefarious stuff, even though it would like to be used to control and to diminish us, that contrast is actually waking up many, many people. And there are always forces behind the scenes trying to drive this change and this kind of unifying experience. So we definitely want to end on that today. We want to leave people with a sense of promise of what this moment really entails. And in the one sense, and we've discussed this before, we don't want to just sort of like carry on as we have been, just good enough. Ironically, even though things seem more daunting than they have before, even in our lifetimes, that contrast, again, is driving the sense of opportunity and the necessity for the awakening. That's beautiful and that's exciting. And I think that's a great point to end on. So we want to thank you for joining us again on this podcast. We hope you'll join us again in a few weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.